All right, so we're going to be going in this lecture over all of the layer blend modes. Now, we're not going to be going over all of the ones in Photoshop because there are some that aren't covered in Procreate, but most of them are, and the ones that aren't covered aren't really going to be important when it comes to digital painting. You're probably never going to use them. So, as far as this goes, we are going to go over all the ones in Procreate. So you can see here, I have this base layer, which is going to be what our blend modes are going to interact with so we can get an idea of what they do. And then we have this layer, which is grayscale. We have from black to white, and then a gradient from black to white, and then just 3 color boxes of black, white, and then 50% gray. Okay. And then we have up here, we have a dark color wheel, mid-tone color wheel, and a light color wheel, and then a gradient from red all the way through all the hues back up to red, and then these color blocks, which are used for CMYK and RGB color systems. Okay, so we're going to be using these to create our blend modes to interact with this layer beneath. So our base layer, which is this tree, this valleyscape, it's set to normal. We're not going to change that, okay? But we are going to be changing these as we go. So let's start with the first one, which is going to be our darken section, and we're going to start with multiply, okay? Now, what multiply does is it multiplies the layer on top by the layer beneath, okay? So you can see here, white does nothing. The image is not changed at all. If we're looking over all the way on the right side, I'm going to make a new layer here and draw on it so you can see where I'm pointing. So, too big. Let's get a pencil. Okay, so white, which is over here on this side of things, completely unchanged, but if you look over here where it's black, it goes all the way dark, because if we look at white as a value of 0, when you multiply white with anything, you get nothing, right? So it's not going to do anything. When you multiply black with something, it's going to go all the way black, okay? So that's multiply, and if we look over here with our values, our colors over here, you can see does the same thing. It's just multiplying it by whatever's underneath. So the dark color wheel is going to be a lot darker than the light color wheel. The light color wheel almost has no change to it. It's just a little bit of a difference, okay? So that's multiply. What you're mostly going to use multiply for will be creating shadows, and that's going to be the majority of its uses, okay? The next one in the list is going to be linear burn. Now, linear burn is similar to multiply. It's going to decrease the value of the base color based on the value of the blend color, okay? So the blend color is this layer on top, and the base color is what's below, right? So you can see it's similar to multiply, except it's going to provide more contrast in the darker areas, okay? So you can see white has no effect, but black does have an effect, and if we switch between this and multiply, you can see that it provides a lot more contrast over here where it gets into the dark blues than multiply does, okay? Multiply just kind of will start to even everything out as it gets darker, and linear burn is going to provide that contrast that we're looking for, okay? Next one is color burn, and color burn is going to increase the contrast between the base layer and the blend layer, similar to like when you use the burn tool, okay? So if you ever use the burn tool in Photoshop, color burn is the same thing, only it covers the entire layer, and it's basing it off of whatever is on the blend layer on top. And we can see if we change this one to color burn as well, it's going to do the same exact thing. Let's look at darken, okay? Darken is when the two layers get compared, okay? So the layer on top, which is our blend layer, and then the layer beneath, which is our base layer. The blend layer compares the two layers, and whichever value is darker is the one that gets represented, okay? So for example, over here on the right, if we look in the white area, there's nothing, everything is darker than white, okay? So nothing's changing, right? But if we look over here where it gets darker, it's comparing, okay, is the value below this lighter or darker than what's in my blend mode? If the blend mode is darker, then we're going to show that instead. If the blend mode is lighter, it's not going to show up at all. So you can see in the 50% area here, anywhere where the original image was brighter than 50% gray, it got filled in with 50% gray, like the hole in those trees there, or in the sky, it just got filled in 50% gray. Okay, does that make sense? Moving on, let's go to next is the lighten category. Okay, so lighten layers are going to be basically the exact opposite of the darken category. Okay, lighten does the opposite of what darken does. So if we select that, it's going to do the same thing as darken, but instead it's comparing the values, and instead of going with the darkest one, it's going with the lightest one. So you can see here white is all the way light because it's picking the lightest value and selecting that one instead. And same with on this side over here, dark, there's nothing darker than black, and so it's unaffected. Okay, essentially the exact opposite of darken. Okay, let's go to the next one, which is going to be screen. Okay, screen is the opposite of multiply. Okay, it takes anything it takes anything lighter than the value beneath it and multiplies it by the chosen color, while multiply takes anything darker than the original layer and multiplies it by the chosen color. Okay, so screen, opposite of multiply, and we can see, let's change this one to screen 2 just so you can see. And we can turn that off and turn that back on. Does the exact same thing. The darker the value is, the less effect it's going to have when you're using screen, and the brighter it is, the more effect it will have. Okay, so that's screen. Next one is add. Okay, so add is pretty similar, it's just a lot less strong. It's almost the same thing, just not as powerful. And then color dodge, oops, yeah, there we go, color dodge here. It's going to decrease the contrast based off of what the values are. So it's going to create really saturated midtones and then blown out whites. It's another one that you probably won't use that much, not very common, but it is there for the rare circumstances where you might like the effect it provides. And if we turn off the color, you can see what it does there as well. Okay, so just to explain it again, it's decreasing the contrast. Okay, it's creating saturated midtones and then blowing out the whites in order to create that contrast. Okay. Next, we have, let's turn this off, bring this one back on, move on to our contrast category. So contrast is our layer modes that apply both the lightening and darkening effects. Okay, so if it's darker than 50% gray, then it's going to have a darkening effect applied, and if it's higher than 50%, it'll have a lightening effect. So it's possible to have basically both multiply and screen happening at the same time using these layers. Okay, so it's just going to be comparing anything in the blend layer, anything darker will get multiplied, anything lighter won't. So if we use overlay, okay, it's basically multiply and screen combined, okay, but at half strength. So instead of being full blown all the way out, it takes whatever screen would be and whatever multiply would be and brings them down to 50% of their original power. Okay, so instead of going all the way black, even though it's black all the way on this left side over here, it's just darkening it by 50% of what it normally would be. Instead of bringing it all the way white like it otherwise would have, it only brings it to 50% of that. This is really useful for adding texture layers and things like that, because it will evenly distribute over the whole image, especially if your texture layer has different values to it. And you can lower the opacity to get the desired effects without distorting your image too drastically. So if we change the color one over here to overlay, you can see as well, right? All it's doing is changing that, and if it's darker, it makes it darker. If it's lighter, it brings it lighter than the base image, okay? Next one is going to be soft light. So let's check out soft light here. Well, let's do hard light first. Hard light is basically the exact same as overlay, except for instead of having that 50%, it's just at 100%. So it's including multiply and screen on the same layer. Anything brighter than 50% gets the screen filter applied, and anything darker than 50% gray gets the multiply layer combined. But instead of bringing things down to 50% like we did with overlay, we're just pulling it out all the way. Okay, so you can see here, if we compare it back with overlay, anything in the black range doesn't go all the way black, but on hard light it does. Same with the whites. Okay, and we can compare it up here as well. We'll turn that off. Okay, same thing. All right, moving on. So we have hard lights, then we have soft light. Okay, soft light is just, I mean, it's, you could think of it as a softer version of overlay. It does a similar thing, has a similar effect, just not nearly as powerful. Okay, same effect. All right, moving on. We have our next category, which is the difference category. So in the difference category, what it does is it looks for variations between layers to create the blend. Okay, so we'll start with exclusion here. Exclusion is going to inverse the layers. So black has no effect and white is complete inversion. Okay, so anywhere in between there, it's going to be a less intense effect, right? So we can see here, everything that's white on the right side has been completely inverted. Okay, complete opposite of what it was before. And then same on the left, when we go to black, nothing has happened. We can do the same thing if we go over here to our color layer and we do exclusion. We'll turn that on. and you can see it does the same thing. Okay, pretty simple. It's a pretty specific effect. You're not going to use it very often, but maybe you want to make something look like it's from like another dimension or something like that, and you really just want to twist the viewer's eye, then you can use the exclusion layer. Okay, the next one is going to be difference. Okay, now difference inverts the value based off of the difference between layers. So small differences are going to get darker and big differences are going to get lighter. Okay, so let's change this to difference. We'll turn that layer on. You can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so the bigger the difference is between the base layer and the blend mode, okay, the more inversion there is, and the less of a difference there is, the less inversion there is. It's pretty similar to exclusion. Once again, the difference is pretty minimal. It's not something you're going to need to be using fairly often at all, if ever, but that's what it does. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which is subtract. Okay, now subtract is essentially the opposite of add. It subtracts the value of the blend layer. Okay, so if the blend layer is up here, you could see the whites. The value of white is very high. It's a very high value. So it's taking that and subtracting it from the image underneath and only leaving the darkest values behind, which is why it looks black. On the side where it's supposed to be black, there's absolutely no difference because there's nothing to subtract. The value is absolute 0. Okay. The next one, the next category is going to be the color category. Okay. So we'll change this to color. The color category only affects hue, saturation, and luminosity. Okay. Unlike the other one. So hue, what it's going to do, it's only going to change the hue, but not the saturation or value. So you can see right here, since this is grayscale, it turns everything black and white. But if we come to our color layer and we change it to hue, turn this back on, it's only going to be changing the hue. So luminosity and saturation stays the same. So in the base image, if something's really desaturated, it's not going to change that and make it more saturated. Or if something is really dark, it's not going to make it brighter, but it will adjust whatever the saturation and luminosity pixels hue is to whatever is put on top. So you can see in the sky, still stays the same value, still stays the same saturation, but instead the hue is changed to this yellow or wherever it is on the color wheel. Okay. The next one is going to be, oops, wrong layer, let's do this one, is saturation. This is similar to hue, but instead it only changes the saturation. So in this one, hue is unaffected, luminosity is unaffected, but saturation is affected. Okay, so the more saturated it is, the more of a difference it's going to make. On here, all of these are equal saturation, so there's virtually no difference. Okay, next one is going to be color. Okay, so color, it's going to combine hue and saturation layers and only leave the luminosity untouched. Okay, so it's going to take whatever the hue and saturation is of the blend layer, which is our color wheels and stuff like that. You're going to take that, and that's going to alter the layer underneath, but the luminosity, which is its values, how light and dark it gets, stays unchanged. Okay, so it's going to bring the saturation up to match whatever's on the top layer, and it's going to bring the hue around to match whatever's on that layer, but the actual values, how bright or dark it is going to be unchanged. This is pretty good if you want to change the color of something. You can make a new layer on top of your painting and then paint over it, and it's going to completely change the color while not actually changing your value structure. So that's really useful. And then the last one is going to be luminosity. Okay, so luminosity is a really weird one. You'll rarely use it, but what luminosity does is basically the opposite of color. Okay, it's going to leave hue and saturation untouched, but it will change the luminosity. Okay, so it's going to adjust the base layer's value based off of the blend layer's value, but it's going to leave the hue and the saturation the same as it was before. So, you know, all the greens, the blues in the sky, all that stuff stays the same, but how bright or dark it is going to be changed to match what's on the top layer. Okay, once again, something you won't use, but now that you understand it, you can possibly think of a use for when you might want to use it. Anyways, that's it for this lecture. Those are all the layer blend modes. I know it's a lot to take in. Luckily, as we go through this course, whenever I switch to a new blend mode, I will explain it and tell you why I'm doing it and what it does to give you a little bit of a refresher. And that way you can see actual real-world painting examples of when you might be using these layers. So that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you guys in the next one.